Howdy folks, it's me, Josh. Ever since the founding of the United States, there's been a tradition that no president should serve longer than 2 terms. The tradition was first established all the way back with George Washington, who, against popular demand, declined to run for a 3rd term in 1796 and instead stepped down as John Adams succeeded him. And ever since then, the general 2-term rule has stayed in place in order to avoid a potential dictatorship. For the next 140 years or so, there weren't any real major challenges to this rule except a few unsuccessful instances. In 1876, many in the Republican Party had pushed President Grant to run for a 3rd term, but Grant declined, instead being succeeded by Rutherford Hayes in a hotly contested election. And in 1912, Theodore Roosevelt, though only having been elected president once before, had served for the length of about 2 terms and ran for what many called a 3rd term, but ultimately split the Republican vote, allowing Woodrow Wilson to be elected. However, even though this rule had remained in place ever since the country's founding, it wouldn't be long before it would be broken for the first and only time. In 1932, after the Great Depression tanked the American economy, many blamed then-President Herbert Hoover for the downturn, ultimately leading Democrat Franklin Roosevelt to win in a landslide. After his election, FDR would end up enacting a series of economic reforms known as the New Deal, meant to help revitalize the American economy through public works and such. The New Deal would end up causing a major voter realignment, as many former Republican New Dealers would end up becoming Democrats. But the Democrats also still faced backlash from conservative Southerners who pushed back against FDR's liberal New Deal agenda. In 1936, FDR would win another landslide victory against Republican Alf Landon, securing a 2nd term. But after this, Roosevelt was intent on retiring after the end of his 2nd term, not wishing to break tradition by seeking to stay in office any longer. Roosevelt began priming Harry Hopkins, the head of the Works Progress Administration, which had been used to implement New Deal policies, to be his successor. However, Hopkins was notably unpopular and divisive among Democrats and wasn't as strategic as Roosevelt in maintaining ambiguity and ease from opposition. But then, in 1939, Germany invaded Poland, starting the Second World War. And this changed everything, as the main question for debate across the country would be involvement in the war. Ever since World War I, many Americans were firm on neutrality, not wanting America to get involved in another foreign war. But FDR didn't quite share this sentiment. FDR saw Axis expansion across Europe as a direct threat to democracies worldwide, including America, and wanted to get the US involved in order to stop this expansion. The Republicans, meanwhile, stayed firm on a non-interventionist stance, as many didn't want to get America involved in the war, or even pushed for complete isolationism. However, after the fall of France in 1940, many in America began pushing for some level of American support to Britain in order to prevent a complete German victory. And FDR, seeing this unfold across Europe, decided against stepping down and instead ran for an unprecedented 3rd term. During the Republican National Convention, Republicans were split between Robert Taft, an isolationist Midwestern conservative and the son of former President William Howard Taft, and Thomas Dewey, a non-interventionist New York liberal who gained nationwide fame and popularity for his role in tackling many prominent members of the Mafia. But although Dewey seemed to be the favorite at first, neither of them managed to gain enough votes to become the nominee. Enter Wendell Willkie. Out of nowhere, Wendell Willkie, a corporate lawyer and a Democrat, jumped into the race as a Republican only because he couldn't run as a Democrat with FDR running for a 3rd term. Willkie was pretty much ideologically identical to FDR, but with the RNC in a deadlock, he managed to win the Republican nomination as a compromise candidate. And lost. With Willkie defeated, FDR would go on to serve a 3rd term, the first and only president to do so. And after America's eventual entry into the war after Pearl Harbor, the Allies would end up coming out victorious. But a bit over 10 years later, the US would end up ratifying the 22nd Amendment, which formally prevented any president from running for a 3rd term again. But what if that changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, FDR didn't break from the two-term tradition and instead followed through on his initial plans to step down from the presidency after the end of his second term? With FDR stepping down, he would likely still prop up Hopkins as his chosen successor, despite his declining health, noting that his own paralysis didn't stop him from becoming president. As I said earlier, Hopkins was rather unpopular and divisive among Democrats, as many other Democrats would likely run as well. In the end, it's very likely that liberal progressive Democrats would, begrudgingly, support Hopkins at Roosevelt's behest, but Southern conservatives would try to run someone else, ultimately growing the divide in the Democratic Party. In the end, Hopkins still probably ends up becoming the nominee, but would end up being an extremely weak candidate. The Republicans, meanwhile, without FDR running for a third term, wouldn't see Wendell Willkie running away with the nomination, meaning it likely ends up going to either Thomas Dewey or Robert Taft. And due to his widespread support among Republican voters, as well as him having been the initial favorite for the nomination, Thomas Dewey probably ends up securing the Republican nomination. And so, the 1940 election would end up seeing a race between Harry Hopkins and Thomas Dewey. Dewey would likely campaign on a non-interventionist platform, not wanting to get the US involved in the war, likely also attacking Hopkins for his poor health and not being fit to serve. Hopkins, meanwhile, would promote interventionism in the war and continued support for the New Deal, and would probably attack Dewey for his young age and inexperience when it came to foreign affairs, never having held political office at this point. In the end, due to his widespread fame and popularity across the country, the still great amount of support for non-interventionism, and growing divisions and low energy among the Democrats, I could see Dewey winning the election, carrying several northeastern states as well as much of the Midwest and Plains due to his non-interventionist stance. So, as a result, Thomas E. Dewey ends up being elected as the 33rd President of the United States, the youngest ever at only 38 years old. So, what would Dewey do? As a non-interventionist, Dewey wouldn't have taken the same steps that FDR did in our timeline in order to push the US into war. So, when it comes to Japan, it's very likely that Dewey would attempt to negotiate with Japan in order to preserve peace in the Pacific, and due to his inexperience with foreign affairs, would possibly give concessions to Japan as a result, which would draw widespread criticism, while Dewey would defend it as necessary actions to keep the US out of war. So, as a result, it's unlikely that Pearl Harbor happens in this timeline, as the US isn't drawn into World War II as they were under FDR. And then there's the war in Europe. Dewey was much more anti-communist than Roosevelt, and so, if the US even passes the Lend-Lease Act at all, it probably wouldn't include aid to the Soviet Union, so the Soviets don't get the critical aid that they needed in order to win the war. Without US support, the Soviets wouldn't be able to effectively defend against the German advance, as we'd likely end up seeing a German victory in Stalingrad and an eventual push towards Moscow as the Soviets end up collapsing. With the fall of Russia, likely happening in 1943, Britain would see a major decrease in support for continuing the war as Churchill falls out of favor among the British populace. And depending on just how stubborn Churchill is and how long it takes him to step down from power, the war between Germany and Britain could end up continuing anywhere from a few weeks longer to a few years longer. But we're gonna assume that Churchill clings to power as long as he can, and probably isn't removed until somewhere around 1946. And after he's removed, the British would end up making peace with Germany, as the Germans end up winning the war. And since this is obviously way too big for me to cover in this one video, BAM! Germany ends up enacting their plans for Lebensraum in the Soviet Union, as the borders of the rest of Europe are redrawn to best suit the desires of the Axis powers. And in France, the Germans would likely end up evacuating their occupied territories, giving the Vichy government control of most of its former lands, as Pétain continues to push for a stronger France. France likely ends up joining Italy, Spain, and Portugal in the creation of a Latin bloc centered around these nations' Latin Catholic heritage, in opposition to Hitler and Germany, as the continent likely divides along these lines. The UK, meanwhile, is able to continue its existence as it was, but due to German dominance over Europe, is likely forced to cooperate with them. And without the dominance of the US and the USSR after the war, Europe is never forced to decolonize, holding on to their colonial lands as the British Empire survives. Anyways, back to Dewey. In 1944, it's possible that Dewey could see a primary challenge from someone like Douglas MacArthur, who would run on a more conservative platform and advocate for intervention in the war. But it's very unlikely that he'd be able to oust Dewey, an incumbent president, from the nomination, as Dewey is renominated by default. The Democrats, meanwhile, would struggle to find a good candidate to run. It's possible that we could see Wendell Willkie run again, before he, died of a heart attack that same year, or someone like Henry Wallace, but he was a bit too weird for most Democrats. As a result, it's likely that the liberal progressives end up losing their grip on the Democratic Party as the Southern conservatives take hold once again and lose in a landslide against Dewey, who wins a second term, also by default, as the Democrats fail to find a good candidate. In terms of domestic policy, Dewey would likely continue many liberal reforms, allowing for desegregation, though at a more moderate pace than brought about by Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower in our timeline. And without US involvement in the war, recovery from the Great Depression likely ends up taking longer, possibly not seeing full recovery until the 1950s. But though the Allied defeat in the war would be humiliating for his administration, the US doesn't really end up losing all that much, and it doesn't become a major issue. In 1948, it's likely that Dewey departs, not running for a third term either. And with German dominance over Europe and the Atlantic, and Japanese dominance over Asia and the Pacific, it's very likely that the isolationist wing of the Republican Party end up gaining control, as Robert Taft ends up succeeding Dewey, becoming the 34th President of the United States, as the US ends up following its traditional, isolationist, conservative path, focusing on domestic affairs. And so, with that, America, along with the rest of the world, ends up entering a new age as things begin to shape out radically different from how they did in our world. So I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, make sure to stick around for more. And hey, you could also, maybe, subscribe or something. So that's it for today's video. Well, till next time, see ya.